There were many social issues that caused the American Revolution. Religion was one of the biggest causes. Before the American Revolution, we have little knowledge on religion other than it was the Anglican Church. This was due to the recording of religious thought and activities was left to the clergymen who had not been trained in the scientific methods of historiography. What we do know, though, is that people turned away from the Anglican Church due to it being run by the British monarchy at the time. They couldn't keep living under the religion of people they were revolting against. Along with this, they also abolished church legal establishments and introduced freedom to worship in the Bill of Rights afterwards. People started to turn away from religion because they were given it because of a lot of tension, and the British hated that they didn't have the power they once did over the people due to their lack of religion. The death of English traditions was also a big factor in the American Revolution, because in England and Britain there had been an intertwining of church and state. Religion was a massive part of the government, especially in the monarchy, but with the constitution they tried to separate as much as possible. The church wouldn't have the same political matters. America became the first country on national levels to separate church and state, and alongside that was a change in punishment in states. While branding, ear cropping and other cruel and unusual punishments were common practice, once the revolution started to happen in the early days, these common practices were rid of. So much that later on, after the revolution, it became a part of the Bill of Rights. People wanted away from British tradition, as they seen it as British overrules. And this caused a great deal of unrest due to British no longer being able to use methods to keep the Americans in line. Boston had become an important feature to colonial America, as it was the main shipping port to and from Britain, which meant it held a lot of power and money due to the trades that it could provide. This made it a highly profitable place for Britain and increased its value. Also, because of where Massachusetts is located, it's the main convent for British troops who were stationed there after the 7 Years' War, as it's near the French-Canadian border. Due to the high amount of British soldiers stationed in Boston and the civil unrest due to taxation, on the 5th of March 1770, a fight broke out. As people began to hear the argument, they joined in, till it got to a point where ex-slave Crispus Attucks was leading the crowds. The soldiers launched bullets into the crowd, killing 5, Attucks included. The official British report called it an unhappy disturbance, but Boston leaders immediately called it a horrid massacre. Both sides had made it their own propaganda. This all led to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, which was in protest of the Tea Act. The Protestants refused to allow authorities to unload tea, and when it became dark, they rowed out the ships to unload. They dumped the tea into the harbour. The damage the Sons of Liberty caused by destroying 340 chests of tea in today's money was worth more than $1,700,000. The British East India Company reported £9,659 worth of damage caused by the Boston Tea Party. This was unbelievable and shook the British and American economies, as well as created a much bigger divide and hatred between the British and Americans.
The works of de Tocqueville are especially key in understanding the role race relations regarding Native Americans and African slaves played in causing the American Revolution in 1776. De Tocqueville talks of the oppression non-aristocratic or noble classes faced in France and in the 13 colonies, and speaks of the rejection of an overbearing state necessary for democracy and a successful revolution. The colonists, perhaps unjustified in their disgruntled attitudes towards race, sympathise with this component of de Tocqueville's political philosophy. The colonists could point to an array of occasions they believed the British Crown had overstepped its legal boundaries and influence. It is helpful to first examine the natives and their significant role, specifically the British monarchy's actions regarding their lands. The British had a degree of gratitude for the native populace for their efforts during the 7 Years' War in favour of the British, and the sizable contribution in assisting the British against the French and Spanish in North America. Due to this, in 1763, the British announced the Royal Proclamation, which legally forbade colonists from settling west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists despised this given their hatred of the natives for their race and for the many conflicts they had between each other settling in North America. They saw this as a breach of their rights to settle, owing to a foreign war they had no choice in participating in, solidifying an increasing view they should be separate from the British state given their relations with constant wars and then being dragged into it financially or restricted by it legally. Relating to de Tocqueville, he mentions the breach of rights and restrictions an oppressive state will place on its subjects, and that often they are met with revolt and discontent if done severely and unjustly, with the colonists believing the Royal Proclamation to tick both those boxes. De Tocqueville's philosophy concerning a nation's treatment of its citizens and how the volatile nature of the state can cause a revolt within an abused society is applicable to both the colonists and their slaves when examining slavery as a cause of the revolution. One of the ways in which colonists were enraged was owing to, once again, British foreign affairs as they faced slave revolts in the Caribbean, where slaves outnumbered settlers upwards to 20 to 1. The British then moved many of the revolting slaves to their 13 North American colonies, something the colonists living there did not agree or consent to. This action resulted in slave revolts and uprising in Manhattan in 1712, and a revolt in North Carolina in 1733 known as the Stono Rebellion, in which 21 colonists were killed. Furthermore, the French and Spanish devised plots to arm African American slaves to revolt and offered amnesty if they reached Spanish Florida. Vitally, the colonists did not see the French and Spanish as their enemies, and they weren't, only the enemy of the British. These earlier plots and rebellions indicated to the colonists they were going to be continually brought into foreign affairs they saw no benefit in being involved in, ensuring a growing resentment of the British, something to de Tocqueville warns about in Democracy in America. Later actions regarding the slaves from the British would become more enforced and sometimes designed to agitate the colonists. The British pragmatic approach towards slaves affected economic development in the colonies, so the British had ideas to use armed Africans for imperial campaigns far from the colonists, which is a definite crossroads in outlook regarding the slaves. This differing approach culminated in the Somerset case in 1772, in which the British ruled slavery was unsupported by British law and outlawed it in the British Isles. This unnerved the colonists, still being heavily reliant on the continued use of slaves for the economic benefit they brought them. Although not outlawed in colonies, colonists were certain it would soon be, and some influential and wealthy individuals who were later to orchestrate the revolution came out against it, namely future President George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And with support of a rich and respected upper class, the storm of revolution was increasingly matching up with de Tocqueville's idea of how they occur in a disgraced and discontented society like the colonies had become, at least in the view of the colonists. The tipping point came with the threats from Lord Dunmore in 1775, who offered to free and arm Virginian slaves to put down settler revolts, which colonists took as a harmful insult to their society, causing a serious threat as the British bureaucracy they despised was now threatening violence, and within less than a year the revolution and the colonists were en route to forming a new nation and new government.
Toqueville argues that the rise of democracy is that of a drive by human nature, of which is a want for self-preservation and freedom. With this, he refers primarily to the French Revolution and the push for rights from that, although that was very much influenced by the American Revolution, especially with the intervention of Americans such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson in French society, and the subsequent revolution in France. Revolution and Enlightenment in Europe have very similar causes to the uprisings in the British colonies, especially the French Revolution, when it comes to the financial situations. Financial dissidence began with Britain's involvement with the wars of the 1700s, largely the wars of the Spanish Succession, Austrian Succession, and the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War especially induced heavy debts on both Britain and France, and more heavily involved their North American colonies. British debt rose to £130 million by the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, and Britain's solution to this was to more heavily tax its American colonies. With the heavy taxes such as the Sugar Act of 1764, Stamp Act of 1765, Townshend Act of 1767, and Tea Act of 1773, colonists became even more distrustful and hateful towards their overlords. With the anger from the Boston Massacre and Tea Party, the First Continental Congress in 1774 was inevitable of a population filled with hate for their overlord. They planned to boycott British goods and demanded more rights. However, independence was not being considered just yet. This is somewhat mirrored by the anger of France in the years prior to the French Revolution and the rise of the National Assembly. It can be argued that democracy was not out of people's powers to stop, but rather a consequence of mistreatment of a population, as is a common cause of civil uprisings across the time of